previous video I showed how you can split a value for multiple items in the query editor, also known as Power Query. This time I will show you how you can do the same thing using DAX. We use the same example as before, so just to remember, this freight cost should be split for these two items, $25 each, but the imported data is showing the full freight cost of $50 for each one. In this case, let's consider that you can fix using Power Query for whatever reason. So as before, here in our Power BI model, we have these three invoices, and invoice number 10 is the same one from the example in the Excel file. We know that each row in our data stands for a different item in a single invoice. So let's start our measure to get the correct freight item. We'll do this step by step so you can get a good understanding of how this works and the logic behind it. The first thing we need to figure out is the number of items per invoice. So we'll start using the count rows function over the table 1. Now let's duplicate this visual and leave just invoice number and item column. Let's also add this new measure that we are developing. Now we need to understand a bit of filter context. You can see that the measure is showing 1, which corresponds to the only row in our data set which has the invoice number and item combination in this filter context. The same applies for each number 1 you see here. And these are all the rows from the data set, that's why in the total row, filter context is showing 9. Now to figure out the number of items per invoice, we need to remove the item column from the filter context. And as you can see, count rows is considering the new filter context, which stands for 2 rows of our dataset, which means 2 items from our model that are inside invoice 10, 4 items in invoice 20 and 3 items in invoice 30. However, if we try to divide the freight cost by this function, it might look that we got the correct result. $50 is indeed the freight cost for invoice 10. But the problem arises as soon as we add the item column back to the visual. Why is that? Well, our filter context has changed once again. And if you remember, when we had invoice and item in the filter context, count rows returned 1 for each row. So in each of these rows we are dividing the freight cost by 1. Let's remove this division and just leave the count rows. We need somehow to change our filter context to ignore this item column and consider only the invoice column for the count rows. So it's time to use the calculate function, which can change our filter context. We start with calculate and use count rows as our expression. Now for our calculate filter, we need a function that can remove the item column from our filter context, and that's the all function. So let's type all and add the table item column. Now we are getting the right number of items per invoice. Now we can divide the freight cost by this value and we will have the correct freight per item. There is only one problem to solve now. You can see that our total is showing 133, and that is not the sum of our freight per item as you would have expected if you have an Excel background. Remember, this is all about filter context. So here in the total row, our freight cost total is $1,200, and if you remember, the count rows total is 9, so 1200 divided by 9 results in 133. In the total row, it's considered our whole data set all over again. We need to tell DAX to focus in the invoice number. You can do this by using a table function called values, and then use SumX to iterate over it. Let's see what values does. Let's go to the data view and click new table. Now let's use values, table 1, invoice. As you can see, now we have a table with unique values for the invoice number, and it consists of 3 rows only. This was just a test. Let's delete it and go back to our measure. So we will start with SumX, and the first argument is the table to iterate, which will be the values, table 1, invoice, and then our expression. And now we have the correct result. Let me show you what DAX does for this row total internally. Here we have the same data and the 2 columns which represent their respective measures above. and on the right side shows what happens in the total row. SumX iterate over the table created by values table 1 invoice. Instead of dividing the total of 1200 by 9, which would result in 133, SumX iterates each row first, dividing the freight cost by the number of items. This right column is the result of each iteration. Just then, SumX sums up this column, returning the result of 350. This is equivalent to the SumProduct function in Excel, which also iterates each row first and then sums up the results. Now for the correct total measure, we simply sum the sales measure and the fried item measure, and we are done. I hope these tips have helped you. If you know different ways to do this calculation, let me know in the comments below. If you have any suggestions, please post in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please give a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. See you soon!